Well, thank you very much, Ifkan. It's a pleasure to be here again this year, and thank you for inviting me. We've heard a lot of energy aspects this morning. Almost every speaker and panelist talked about energy in one way or another. So I think I'll try to see if I can tie some of that together. Of course, the Caspian region, like other regions, is sort of dealing with these three issues at the same time: energy security, sustainable economic development, where energy cross-cuts, whether it's water or food or health or what have you. As part of the SDG process, you can see all these different links. Actually, the former Secretary General Ban Ki-moon used to call it the golden thread. Cuts through all these development goals and issues. And then third, climate change, as you mentioned. And while, in a sense, there are certainly other large regions that emit more, it's still a very relevant issue in terms of the transition from a region that's dominated, except in the hydro states, with oil and gas. So, I mean, we talked about the geopolitics of the region, and that is clear in the context of the war and the tremendous effort of the EU to diversify their energy supplies and what that's meant for global oil and gas markets in particular, but overall supply chains in general, including for renewable energy. We've talked a little bit about China, but I want to say that I think, having watched this and seeing China's increasing investment in the region, that the events last week were very significant. And we'll see exactly all the details as they develop. But clearly, the major initiatives that Xi Jinping announced in terms of infrastructure investment, oil and gas, hydro, solar in Kyrgyzstan, just a plethora of announcements and activities. And this, I was looking at, Boston University has a dashboard on China energy finance. If you haven't looked at it, it's interesting, because it goes over the last 15, 20 years of what China has financed around the world in terms of energy. So for Central Asia, over the last 15 years, China's provided about $32 billion from just the two policy banks, the Export-Import Bank and the China Development Bank. That's not including some other financing mechanisms that they have and banks, particularly that finance like renewables and company financing. So huge amount, right, compared to any other outside investor, and even compared to the IFI's investments. Most of it was in oil and gas, but a lot of it was in pipelines, but a lot of it was in, some of it was in energy transmission, hydro, and a small amount in coal, which they've invested heavily more in Southeast Asia and some of the other regions in coal, Pakistan, et cetera, than in Central Asia, but they've done some. So the big challenge in terms of what this means, what does it mean for the energy systems, for the infrastructure systems, for the governance and institutional aspects, because obviously you read what the G7 said about it. They're using non-market practices and admonished them in terms of their economic coercion and, of course, the famous debt trap diplomacy aspects of it. But I see it as very important to mention in the context of taking advantage of the war and to some extent the preoccupation with Ukraine by Russia and, of course, the US and others as well. And so I'll stop at that in terms of the broader framework. I wanted to mention, I think, 5 issues or priorities that I see, and some of you may have heard some of this when I was on the CPC webinar on renewables, but I think it's worth repeating because obviously they're pretty basic principles. So we heard about sort of the environmental issues, and the ambassador from Kyrgyzstan talked about the energy-water nexus. And I have seen over the years, and this has been borne out by the communications that we used to have with all of our posts in the region, about how important the water management issues and those relations were for political as well as economic and environmental reasons. And now with climate change, it becomes even more important because the trends that we're seeing in terms of glacier melt and in terms of moisture in the soil, requirements for irrigation, all those kinds of things are huge issues related to that. And of course, we've had the traditional relationships in terms of the upstream and downstream states. And this, to some extent, is true in the South Caucasus as well as in Central Asia, where you have Georgia, of course, it's very dependent on hydro. Armenia has some hydro, et cetera. But it's especially true in Central Asia, where we've had drought conditions, et cetera, in Kazakhstan, South Kazakhstan and others in 21. And you had Sridhara River, which was one of the 2 major rivers in the region, was down 1/3 of their volume. So, you've got this issue. In the future, it's likely to get worse, in my view. Second, been discussion about the resource potential of the region, large solar and wind resources. And even in Georgia, you're finding that you have significant resources that can be developed for low cost and have in Armenia as well good bids. In Azerbaijan, World Bank just came out with a study that estimates that the feasible offshore potential is 7 gigawatts. And so if you've ever been to Baku, you know how windy it is there. And so big resource potential to diversify their energy mixes. You have to remember that you've got both the sort of the oil states that are relying on oil and gas, and Kazakhstan big on coal. And then you've got, in a sense, the hydro states, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Georgia in particular, that have very high that. So diversification is important both for the oil states as well as for the hydro states. It's a different kind of diversification, but you don't want to be too dependent on hydro, and you don't want to be overly dependent on fossil as well, especially in today's where you're trying to meet the emissions and the renewable targets that the countries have set in the context of the climate COP process. Major investments are needed, but you're seeing now, and my latest estimate, I guess, is that especially in Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, larger projects are being developed, potential of about 15 gigawatts between now and 35. My estimate earlier in the webinar was a little bit higher, but I've scaled that down a little bit. And you've got IFIs all over the place in terms of including the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, Chinese financing. And Uzbekistan recently announced a project. EBRD, big lender. Of course, the big thing that I notice is that there's not many US companies in this list of renewable energy investors. So hopefully that'll change. I mean, we have companies in wind and other areas, solar areas, that are potentially players in this region as well. But attracting the investment that's needed, even though it looks like it's flowing, and a lot of the auctions that have been done have been fairly successful with regards to getting reasonable prices for the solar and wind systems. Like with Masdar was mentioned, Middle East investors in particular, big Saudis, as well as the Europeans and Chinese. There needs to be still further improvements in the legal and regulatory framework. And we see that particularly not only in terms of low prices, which is particularly important now because the cost of some of the renewable projects around the world are going up. You see that dramatically with supply chain issues, but just in terms of the financing cost also going up. And so that's going to be important. Fourth, and I should say that the BNEL does the climate scope report, you know, that in 2022, you look at the comparative ranking. Countries in the Caspian are not well positioned with regards to the scores on that in terms of the climate for clean energy investment. So, and they go through a number of areas that are for improvement, and I won't dwell on that now. Fourth, when we talk about the transition, the issue of the grid becomes vitally important. Not only the high voltage transmission grid, but the lower voltage transmission grids as well. And we're seeing that. Euroelectric came out for a report in the EU in terms of their transition that says 70% of new renewable connections is in the low voltage transmission system. Now, for the 1,000 megawatts, yeah, those are going to feed into the high voltage grid, but renewable development can occur at the various levels, and so there needs to be improvements in the distribution system. And if you look, traditionally, the International Energy Agency has used about 35–40% of total power investment needs to be in T&D. It's not all generation. So we get fixed on generation, but the inefficiencies and the need for modernization of the transmission and distribution system is really important. And that feeds into the last point, which is regional cooperation. And in aid, we try to work, and actually starting with parallel transmission agreements with the 5 countries in the early 90s, to try to sort of strengthen that relationship in both regulatory as well as the physical upgrading of the system. A lot of investment is needed to facilitate that trade, which is really important because of the seasonal variations in the hydro and the new integration of renewables will require much higher strengthening grids. And I think, you know, in Georgia and the South Caucasus, there's also that effort that's probably a little bit more advanced in terms of trying to build up the high voltage network and including exports to Turkey and elsewhere. And so I think that if we're talking about creating a reliable, resilient system, clean system, with higher levels of intermittence. And the countries are talking now about 20–30% renewables over the next decade. The role of natural gas will be important. Important in terms of flexibility of the system, reliability. You already have a lot of the countries that have natural gas. You have the winter problem in the upstream states like Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, where they've struggled to meet the winter heating and other requirements. And so natural gas is an issue there. And so I think that I probably would like to talk some on the nuclear side, Ifkan, but I think I'll stop here now because obviously nuclear is a longer small modular reactors and the nuclear is a longer-term option. But it's not, it is an option that the country should be looking at more closely given the technological developments that are occurring and I think will become a reality by the end of the decade here in the US and Europe.